Yes, if you have a giant mansion and an indoor swimming pool and, three big personal cars, it might not cover all of that. But for regular families that are hardworking, it puts more money in their pockets.
The Prime Minister at a news conference in Calgary defending the policy direction of the federal carbon tax and the next round of rebates to arrive April 15th. It's also a comment the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is taking issue with. And joining us now, Franco, Federal Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Mr. Terrazzano, the PM says 8 out of 10 households will be better off with the rebates. He points to the Parliamentary Budget Officer as doing the math on that. What are you taking issue with? What do you feel the PM is missing?
Well, a couple things. I think he's missing a lot. Number one, did you hear that, folks? Mr. Trudeau thinks the carbon tax only hurts you if you have a giant mansion. But of course, that's not the case. What Trudeau is proving is that he continues to not understand the financial struggles facing ordinary Canadians, because the carbon tax will impact your necessity of life. Whether, you just got to fuel up the minivan to take your kids to soccer, well, the carbon tax will make that more expensive. Or you just got to stay warm during the winter months. Well, the carbon tax will make that more expensive as well. And, the Parliamentary Budget Officer did do the math, and here's what the PBO found. The PBO found that the carbon tax will cost the average Alberta family $911 more this year than what they get back in rebates. So the comments from the Prime Minister are completely tone deaf. And it's just so unfortunate that when so many Canadians and Albertans need relief, you've got the federal government continuing to crank up its carbon tax.
The Parliamentary Budget Officer does make a distinction, though, does he not? That in terms of direct payments through, you point out fuel, home heating, that 80% of households will be better off with the rebates.
But when you look at the costs, right? When you look at all the costs that the carbon tax hammers in the economy, the PBO is very clear. When you look at all the costs, the carbon tax will cost the average family in Alberta $911 more than they get back in rebates. And of course, you should look at all of the costs, right? What Mr. Trudeau is trying to say here using magic math is essentially like me telling my fitness instructor, like, hey, I stuck to my diet if you don't count the Big Mac and fries that I had last night. But, even set aside the data for a second here, right? Think about it. The government imposes a carbon tax, then it charges its sales tax on top of the carbon tax, which costs Canadians about $500 million this year. And then the government spends like $200 million hiring bureaucrats to administer the carbon tax. So there's no way that a federal government can impose its carbon tax, charge its sales tax on top of the carbon tax, then skim hundreds of millions of dollars off the top and somehow make Canadians better off with rebates. It's impossible, and the PBO numbers show that. But one more thing. Mr. Trudeau, with his actions, admitted that the carbon tax makes life more expensive. And he did that when he stood with his Atlantic caucus and he announced relief by taking the carbon tax off of furnace oil for 3 years and leaving 97% of Canadian families out in the cold paying the carbon tax this winter.
Okay, so how do you respond to economists who say use of a carbon tax is likely the least disruptive and most cost-effective way of reducing emissions?
Well, look, there's nothing efficient about a tax in Canada that makes it more expensive for a single mom to fuel up her car to take the kids to hockey or soccer that won't impact global climate change, right? There's nothing efficient about a tax that makes it more expensive for seniors living on fixed income in Canada to stay warm during the winter months, and that won't impact global climate change. And there's nothing efficient about a tax that makes it more expensive in Canada for all of us to buy food that won't impact global climate change. And, I just wish Mr. Trudeau would listen to the people he represents, that is Canadians, because Canadians were very loud and clear, showing 70% of Canadians across every province and every demographic, the vast majority of Canadians opposed the April 1 carbon tax hike. But instead of listening to Canadians, Mr. Trudeau again raised it, and that's making life more expensive.
Okay, so Franco, if not pollution pricing, what then would you suggest as an option for driving emissions reduction? And regardless of what the policy is, it always comes with a cost. It needs to be covered.
Well, step number one, the federal government needs to get out of the way and take the roadblocks out of the way, like Bill C-69, Bill C-48, that's making it more difficult for Canada to displace dirtier forms of energy being produced and consumed abroad. Right? I mean, Canada makes up 1.5% of global emissions. So again, making it more expensive for Canadians to fuel up their car, making it more expensive for Canadians to heat their home, and making it more expensive for Canadian farmers to grow the food, for truckers to deliver the food, and for Canadians to buy the food. You know, that's not reducing emissions in places like China, in India, in Russia, or in the United States. So what we have to do is we have to take a global approach and really kind of try to figure out how we can use our energy to displace dirtier forms of energy being produced and consumed abroad.
In terms of taxing energy, the carbon tax increase came April 1st, the same day as the Alberta fuel tax increase. How does that Alberta tax then factor into this bigger equation?
Well, it's a double whammy on Albertans. It's so unfortunate, right? Because on the one hand, you have Premier Daniel Smith sticking up for Alberta taxpayers against the federal carbon tax. But then on the other hand, Smith raised the provincial gas tax, also making life more expensive in Alberta, right? And, you know, it's great to see the Alberta government talk tough with Ottawa against the carbon tax. Okay, that's good. But you know what the government can actually control in Alberta? How much it taxes. And it's making life more expensive with that provincial gas tax hike that kicked in the same day that Trudeau also hiked his carbon tax.
All right, Franco, we're almost out of time, but I need to ask. Federal budget will be delivered in a week's time. The PM and members of his cabinet have been traveling the country, making billions in spending announcements, things like housing, military. What are your expectations of the budget and how the government is going to pay for all of this?
Well, I'm really worried about this ballooning deficit and all this different spending, right? It's really getting out of control in Ottawa, where they're already forecasting like a $40 billion deficit. I mean, the federal government has already essentially doubled the entire national debt since first coming into office after the 2015 election. And one of the reasons that this federal government has to get a hold of this debt problem is that, look, in this budget year alone, it looks like federal interest charges on the debt will cost about the same amount of money that the feds send to the provinces in health transfers. So what would we like to see? Actually cut spending, actually balance the budget, and actually cut taxes. But unfortunately, it doesn't really look like the federal government is all that interested in fiscal responsibility.
Okay, real quick, do you see an increase in taxation?
I hope not. But look, if the federal government keeps spending money like crazy, I think all taxpayers need to be worried. And look, more tax hikes from the federal government would be coming at the worst possible time, just given all the financial troubles and challenges that Canadians are already going through.
All right, we'll have to leave it there for time. Appreciate your time as always, Mr. Terrazzano. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Franco Terrazzano, Federal Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation.